can't continue anymore. And the reason a lot more people are beginning to speak up as timidly as possible is because that conspiracy of silence has brought us where we are now. And they are still afraid. And they should not be afraid, because in a democracy, fear produces dictatorship.
What can ordinary South Africans do in the face of an ongoing political and economic crisis in South Africa? Well, somebody who has some ideas about the way forward is Songezo Zibi. He is a well-known media and corporate personality who is now entering the uncertain and choppy waters of politics. He describes himself as a public intellectual. Songezo Zibi, welcome to the Solutions podcast.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me.
Right. So, Songezo, you have been quite busy in 2022. You have founded the Rivonia Circle, which we'll talk about in a moment. That's a think tank. And you've also released a new book, Manifesto, a new vision for South Africa. Could we start off, before we talk about those two things, just a bit of background, who you are for those who may not be familiar with you, and your professional journey as well?
So I'm from the Eastern Cape, a place called Mkanduli, which is near Coffee Bay and Hole in the Wall, which a lot more people know of because it's a stunning part of the world. And I grew up there, and I only left when I was 14 years old to go to boarding school. And I've only been back intermittently, really. And I've spent the majority of that time, obviously, in boarding school in Bisho, which is now Buffalo City. And then I went to Nelson Mandela University, which was then Port Elizabeth Technikon, to complete my my national diploma in public relations management. And then I worked for Volkswagen South Africa for 8 years. And the Volkswagen experience was quite pivotal in my life, because when I joined, the factory was about to get shut. And they told me that I would possibly be the last intern they took in the communications department. But there was something called the Motor Industry Development Plan then. Volkswagen was in line to win an export contract for 62,000 Golfs for export. A lot of your viewers and listeners will remember that. And that changed my life, because I didn't have to look for another job. And I stayed for another 8 years and had a wonderful career, which included overseas exposure. And Utneg, when I go back to it, which I do from time to time, looks entirely different. I left Volkswagen. I went to Xstrata PLC, the Johannesburg, the South African operation. I was based at Melrose Arch. I was there for 7 years. And I also get to deal with another part of the economy. Energy policy at the time, when load shedding happened, I was in a combi with lots of analysts from overseas, and the lights were off. So the story that we wanted to tell didn't quite work out the way that we'd wanted to. I spent 7 years at Xstrata, then joined the Financial Mail as senior associate editor. And then the owners of that publication took a huge risk and made me editor of Business Day for 2 years, which is where I really had a profound life-changing experience as well, because it was in the state capture years that I was there from 2014 to 2015. And then I joined ABSA, and I was there for 6 years. And I left in August last year to found the Rivonia Circle, to co-found the Rivonia Circle, of which I am the chair. So that's my story.
Well, you certainly had a very diverse and varied career. And I think what's interesting is that you had exposure to these various sectors in the economy. And I suppose communications has been that thread that's run through. But Absolutely. Now you mentioned the Rivonia Circle. What is your plan with it? What is it intending to achieve? And what are your plans, your ambitions?
I'm going to say what millions of South Africans say. The country is in crisis. It's really an absolute crisis. And I think when you and I had our last interaction before this one, we were talking about the state of the country, and because we needed some work done. And the thing about being in the corporate sector is that you can only analyze and not do much. And yet, especially when you have the background that I have in terms of the industries in which I've worked, geographically where I've been located and so on, often you have very strong feelings about what needs to be done. But it was also out of a sense of deeper crisis, that we have more rhetoric than real ideas about how to turn the country around, and not just the economy, but the institutions that have been destroyed, and how to have a really different society. And together with my co-founders, we decided to start the Rivonia Circle as the institution that is going to do that work, but to also do two extra things which are really important at this time. The first is to do what I'll characterize as civic education work, in order to deepen the democracy and democratic accountability. The second being to identify, train, and nurture a new breed of leader that is more modernist, more urbane, and just more in tune with South Africa itself in all of its spheres, and the world that we live in and that we're going to live in over the next century. That's the purpose of the Rivonia Circle.
Okay, so it's still early days for you and your colleagues, but obviously there's a lot going on in the political landscape, and we've had now 4 years of the Ramaphosa administration. He came in with very high hopes. Many people claimed that he was a reformer. Myself and my colleagues were a bit skeptical of that claim. And, you know, in many respects, he's shown himself to be very much a status quo kind of leader. The ANC as a party is also intellectually adrift. The policies that are on the table are causing enormous damage to the economy and society more broadly. So what is your assessment of the incumbent party at the moment? What has caused this current situation that we find ourselves in?
Well, I'll say two things off the bat. The first is that I never had the optimism that everyone had about our president, for a variety of reasons, but in particular because of the political institution to which he belongs, and that is the ANC. That leads me to the second point that I want to make. The ANC is not intellectually adrift. It is intellectually bereft. There is nothing there. It's an empty shell. The caliber of most of the people who are in cabinet and this national executive committee at the moment wouldn't make it at the most basic level of intellectual conversation in the modern age. That is South Africa's fundamental problem. Any expectation that is not premised on that assessment is going to be too high, and we're likely to set ourselves up for disappointment, because notwithstanding the fact that you might have a president who has reformist intentions, you've got to ask yourself whether his core political institution has got the capability to even know what to reform and how to reform it. That's the first problem. The second problem is whether it has the credibility to convene different sectors of society in order to build national consensus. So what you've had during the Ramaphosa presidency is that even when he appears to have a little bit of consensus, there is no consensus within the ANC itself, because the contestation has never stopped, firstly. And secondly, even when there is, they still can't marshal the intellectual resources within government and the party in order to make those reformist intentions practical. And so we were always going to be caught in this rut. I was never optimistic. And in a way, what we need to do, to be honest with ourselves, is to write off the ANC as an intellectual and a moral force, because none of them are present in the ANC. The Zondo Commission has dealt in thousands of pages with the moral case against the ANC. What we have to ask is whether the task of government since the Ramaphosa presidency demonstrates an ability for the ANC to govern. And I want to argue that things point in the opposite direction. Not only do you and I face the prospect of load shedding while we're having this conversation, municipalities have collapsed. The Auditor General said so. That's got a profound impact on businesses, people, and the economy, and our ability to give people a better life. And so I'm not optimistic, actually. I am incredibly realistic about what we're facing now and what we face in the future, if either our president and the ANC are in charge of the country.
Yeah, I saw a good graphic illustration of this, which was understanding how the ANC has damaged the energy sector And the example that was given was that there was like a Venn diagram. So the one circle was ANC corruption, the other was misgovernance and incapacity, and then the final one was ideology. And all three of those circles overlap. I think the ideological orientation of the party is perhaps the most important and influences the other buckets. So if you think of something like state capture, for example, the president himself has committed himself to cadre deployment as a key pillar of the ANC's governance strategy. That means that you are going to be putting key personnel in positions in state-owned enterprises or the private sector to enforce a very specific agenda that often leads to these perverse incentives and these corrupt outcomes. So what, in concrete terms, Songezo, I mean, what do you think has caused some of these problems? So, I mean, let's look at energy. You mentioned load shedding. How did we get into this position? What has gone wrong there at Eskom?
So I want to go back to the ideological problem that you speak about, because your ideological orientation gives you the tools with which you're going to frame your task. The ANC continues to aspire to a central planning form of government, where the state is the center of development. I think part of the intellectual emptiness of the ANC is that it has not been able to evolve how it understands the task of government or the role of the state. In my view, and what I say in my book, is that the state is a catalyzing agent and an intermediator of interests in society, that it becomes a regulator, but primarily it is a catalyzing agent of the entrepreneurial spirit of the people and institutions in the country. So it needs to be an enabler of progress and development rather than the core driver, because it doesn't have sufficient resources. It is limited to 5-year terms. It has got all of these swings in terms of what it is able to do because of the electoral cycle and intra-party issues, whichever party is in charge. That if you center too much on the ability of the state to function as efficiently as possible, you are inherently going to face a different task. What we need is a state that is a catalyzing agent. Now, what does that mean? That means the state in its orientation talks about its task in this way, that we need to provide affordable or competitively priced energy to the population whose cost is driven down in the longer term, in real terms. That's what the government should do. What we have now is a situation where the state is the center, it can't provide enough electricity, and the net cost of energy is going up over time, which affects your economic competitiveness. So you need to change your orientation, because it is the difference between having a silly limit on private energy generation and enabling the production of energy generation by as many players as possible, but make sure you've got a set of rules that is clear, that is fair, and that takes account of South Africa's socio-economic conditions. And that means you've got to not be insecure about losing the role of monopoly in the energy sector, which the ANC is incredibly insecure about. So it's a different orientation. That's part of how the ANC has lost the fight against the availability, the reliable availability of energy supply, electricity in particular.
Yeah, and energy is really the foundation of economic development in an industrial society. But
yeah, you can't do much without it.
I think my view would be slightly different. I would say that I don't even think that the state should be playing a catalyzing role. I think it should just be providing the basics of infrastructure, perhaps upholding law and order, the sovereignty of the borders, for example, and unleashing the animal spirits, as John Maynard Keynes used to say about business. There's a lot of skill and capital that is ready to be deployed in South Africa. Government just needs to get out of the way, and the private sector will do the rest. Do you agree?
No, I mean, that's catalyzing. It's not getting out of the way because it's really important that you have regulations that are fair and just. When you're a catalyzing agent, it means you create a set of rules that unleash the real potential of the economy and the people in the economy. That's a catalyzing role. It doesn't mean you necessarily get involved in those sectors, but you've got to play a role that facilitates more activity faster and in a manner that is just and fair. Because what we must be careful of in the South African context, and we often take this for granted to say, if you allowed the forces of the market to take care of themselves, you have a situation that does not exist anywhere in the world, where you've got consumer protection agencies and that sort of thing. The forces of law and demand and how they sift out those with poor service and poor pricing and so on don't always work because there's price gouging and all of this kind of thing. So by catalyzing agent is make sure you're not an obstacle to investment, either local investment or foreign investment. And in fact, what you want is to grow your economy with other people's money and not necessarily with taxpayers' money. So how do you play that role, but make sure the rules are clear and fair and just, and you have a judicial system that can adjudicate over disputes, and there are no questions about the solidity of those decisions. You've got to see the state as all three arms of government, not just the government executive. So I'm using the term state deliberately in this conversation to mean all three.
Okay, so we're talking about the role that the state ought to play. So that's a normative question. But then there's an empirical question of what role is the state playing? And currently, if we look around, the state is an abject failure. You mentioned the service delivery issues in local municipalities that the Auditor General raised the red flag about. And as the state starts to retreat from its core functions, and as I've documented on this show many times before, a lot of community groups, civil society actors, private individuals are now stepping into the breach. Do you think that this is a positive development? Do you see this as part of the role that Rivonia Circle will be playing? I know that you're going to be doing lots of road shows and traveling around the country and engaging with more rural constituencies as well. Do you see this trend emerging over the course of your work?
Yes, absolutely. But there's something we really got to be careful of, which has taken root in society in South Africa, which is understanding civic duty and the role of civil society as doing the work the state should be doing, but it cannot do. We might celebrate outsurance for being basically the traffic cops at intersections and managing that. The core problem is that we can't have traffic lights that actually work at intersections. You've got to fix that problem. So it's important that there's a different orientation. That is why a Rivonia Circle, and also in my book, I talk about the importance of democratization and democratic accountability, because democracy is a system of self-government. That means the traffic lights are not an outsurance problem, because what happens is that with outsurance mobile pointsmen, I still switch out of democratic participation and demanding some accountability. That's the challenge that we've created for ourselves. So our message as we go around is that you've got to play your civic duty in two ways. Do what you can for your community, but make sure that the public infrastructure and institutions for which you pay with your taxes are also made to work as hard as you do. Because without that, you don't have a democracy and you don't have a government that actually works.
Yeah, and I think that citizens should be rightfully aggrieved if they're paying taxes and levies to the state for services that they're not providing and then having to cross-subsidize the private sector. But I would say that in the absence of a capable state, I'm very grateful that the private sector can fill the void. And, because the alternative is that you just don't have any traffic control, for example. I mean, I think this kind of goes back to one of your other talking points, Songezo, which is that many people in the professional class seem to be a bit disengaged from politics and kind of social activism. Why do you think that is? And how can we start to stir them out of their slumber?
I think there are three reasons in the main, and I'll say them quickly. The first one is that we've never really had democratization as a project. We had freedom, political freedom as a project, but not democratization, which is where a lot more people feel a greater sense of responsibility for the republic and what happens to it. So that's one of the reasons we formed Rivonia Circle, because that's what we want to provoke. The second reason is that people get terribly intimidated, and I think I can surmise that a lot of people who will watch this are in companies. They know how companies get intimidated the moment they say something that is even remotely honest. What tends to happen is that the companies themselves don't like their employees speaking out as citizens. So there has been an inadvertent collaboration between the ANC and its sensitivities as the governing party and the complicity of companies and other employers, which have had that chilling effect on people and made them not to speak. That's the second thing. The last one is, because of the first two, a lot of people think that politics is something that comes with a special anointing. It's not. When you have a sense of national duty, it becomes your responsibility to find like-minded people in a democracy to make sure that the idea that we have prevails. And I think that sense is not there. Now, how do we get them back into action? We use this crisis, David. I think the people that have always been able to buy their way out of the incapacities of the state can't anymore, because there's no electricity, there's no water, and so you can't run away. The question is, what do you do with that crisis? I think this is ripe for organizing. This is ripe for the production of innovative ideas and even taking existing ideas and using them as political issues going forward. And lastly, this is the right time for fresh leadership, because survey after survey that we do at Rivonia Circle, people want new, more energetic leadership. And therefore, there is an opportunity.
Yeah, and I think it speaks also to the broad role of business in society collectively. If you think of organized business, particularly big business, and you were inside the belly of the beast for a number of years there. And, I think that this lack of confidence, this equivocation, I think often plays into the ANC government's hands, that basically a policy like expropriation without compensation gets put on the table. Business says, okay, well, let's deal with this constructively and engage with government. Or maybe you end up with a watered down version of NHI or EWC or prescribed assets. But ultimately what happens there is you end up reinforcing the ideological agenda of the government, which is inimical to growth and development. And so I've argued on this show and other platforms that business maybe needs to move away from the consensus-seeking approach with government and take on more of a transactional approach to negotiate on policy rather than just to reinforce and reproduce the government's agenda. What do you say to that?
Actually, business needs to be bolder. So the problem with the business sector is that it feels that it needs to stay out of politics. And so there are very few companies that fund political parties and fund political campaigns. It is up to the private family wealth philanthropies to fund civil society, because businesses are being politically correct and not wanting to fund organizations that agitate. And yet it is those organizations that have hit the streets, protested, and made sure that Zuma does not do as much damage as it did. And so there is a need for a change in orientation in business as part of that democratization project that I was talking about, because in other countries, businesses fund political ideas they agree with. And it's time that business takes that fundamental step, because otherwise you have this vacuum where business wants to be in the good graces of people who are misgoverning. And because of that, they are failing to support initiatives that are going to make things better. It doesn't work. The whole consensus building mechanism between the national government and business is premised on national stakeholder relationships, which sometimes are incestuous for various reasons, because there's cross-pollination between the party and certain board members and that sort of thing. It is under these circumstances, David, that now local government has collapsed, because nobody has been paying attention to it. Nobody has been paying attention to it. Yet every business in this economy is in a locality. Now, I'll give you a very quick example about any courier company out there. With load shedding, it means they don't make their delivery targets per day. Facing their margins are being further squeezed by high energy costs, by diesel, and the roads are terrible. And so they pay more for breakdowns and that sort of thing. I'm sure those margins are close to zero or negative margins. That's how, out of a lack of understanding of where the political failures is, you start killing the economy. And I'm sorry, therefore, in this context, business has been complicit in the destruction of the economy. It's the political correctness, it's a lack of understanding of how to drive democratic accountability so that the voice of business is not isolated as it has been now. And often people feel that they shouldn't speak because they don't have the legitimacy. The legitimacy is earned by supporting initiatives that people can see fight for their cause too, beyond charity, signing a check and giving it to the Solidarity Fund.
Yeah, I think CSI initiatives are a way for business to kind of provide cover for themselves and say, oh, look, we're doing our part by painting the fence at a primary school or something. But they're very meek when it comes to dealing with bad policy. I mean, I am encouraged to see the likes of Fani Titi, the CEO of Investec, Gareth Ackerman, the chairman of Pick and Pay, starting to raise some criticisms. I would say it's still rather timid at the moment. But, you know, I think the kind of robust criticism that we see, for example, from the Sibanye Stillwater CEO, Neil Froneman, I think is part of how you achieve results. And I think this idea of business leaders, real leaders make difficult calls and aren't afraid necessarily to alienate others. I think it doesn't mean that you must be aggressive, but you can be firm about defending your interests and the broader needs of the economy.
Now, I'm going to push you there, David. The ANC has known that no matter how frankly government speaks, ultimately they won't hurt them politically. It comes down to that. It's like any market, and politics is a market. If ultimately somebody is not going to hurt your bottom line in any way whatsoever, why would you pay attention to them? You don't. That's business's problem. And that's the difference between business in South Africa and business in more mature democracies. So I insist on this. It doesn't always have to be political parties that they fund, but the reason business becomes isolated and gets ignored by the people is because there's somebody who sits on boards of philanthropies. I know, David, that were it not for those often overseas philanthropies, there would be no civil society in South Africa because business is trying to be politically correct. It can't continue anymore. And the reason a lot more people are beginning to speak up as timidly as possible is because that conspiracy of silence has brought us where we are now. And they are still afraid. And they should not be afraid because in a democracy, fear produces dictatorship.
Right, Songezo, well, you spoke about the need for a fresh, new approach to political leadership. Is that something that you're interested in personally? Do you see yourself entering the cauldron, the gladiators' ring of politics in South Africa?
David, I speak very strongly in my book about the need for people like me to get in the ring. I think I would delegitimize myself completely if at the end of that book, when you ask me this question, I say, oh no, this is for other people. I state in my book that it is my intention to do every single thing that is in that book as a suggestion on how to get a different future, including participating in politics and contesting for any and every position that I find to be the right one for me to do, including that of president. I am also saying that because there is an important shift in mindset that needs to occur. And that is a lot of people with fine qualities, with a lot of vision, are sitting in companies, sitting in government, and lacking the self-belief to take the country forward. And it's important that people do that. Ideas matter though, David, because we've had the politics of personality for too long in South Africa. And the fact that when I talk to you, I come across well, maybe some people might like me as a person, is not sufficient for leadership. You've got to know for what people stand. You've got to know what they are intending to do, and you've got to know that what they say they're intending to do is practical. That's why we formed Rivonia Circle as a think tank, because it's important that we produce the ideas, you find the right people, and only then you can think about political contestation, because you will have credibility. And that's even though Rivonia Circle itself will not become a political party at all forever. However, we've got to start the journey of changing the mindset and creating opportunities for political alternatives. And that's what we've set ourselves to do. I'm busy with that task, and I include myself in the number of people who should put up their hand to take the country forward.
All right. So we have a plethora of political parties, and I think it's actually quite encouraging that we're seeing this fragmentation of politics, these little bites at the ANC's dominance, hopefully turn into death by 1,000 cuts. So, we have established parties like the Democratic Alliance, got New Kids on the Block, Action SA. What's stopping you from perhaps getting involved with these kinds of organizations and, putting your shoulder to the wheel of their causes? These parties have infrastructure set up in place. They have an army of activists. They control governments. In the case of the DA, Action SA is part of multi-party coalitions in a couple of cities. Do you not think that you would be able to amplify your efforts if you joined one of these established parties?
No, it wouldn't. Ideas and values matter a lot to me. And of course, I have considered, and in some instances, I've been approached to join more than one political party. And I said no, for the simple reason that the values and principles matter. I don't think any of those parties stand for the values that I believe in. And those values are social democratic values, David. And secondly, practical ideas matter. Grievance and criticism can only take you so far. But you've got to solve the deep problems of this country. You've got to show an inclination and willingness to build a broad coalition of different actors in society, to unite them behind those values with clearly identifiable priorities and very clear solutions on how you're going to make sure that those priorities are resolved. I can tell you now, the level of thinking about some of our most intractable problems amounts to rhetoric. And this is how this democracy in this country has gotten into trouble before. And you end up with populist ideas that we were talking about earlier, like expropriation without compensation and all sorts of other gimmicks that political parties get involved with in order to get media and social media attention. So I said, no, if I am to get into politics, David, it will be on the basis of things I agree with. And I'm not going to wait around for somebody to say something that I like. Agency means that you start doing the work, and that's what we're busy doing.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously politics is about bargaining, trade-offs, collaborating and working with others. So, I mean, if your nascent entity were to develop more of a presence as a political party, would you be prepared to make those difficult concessions to work with some of these other established players?
I think it's important to accept that in 2024 and onwards, South Africa is going to enter an era of coalitions. The problem with not having principles and ideas, or at least values and ideas, is that you don't have a bargaining chip. You're only bargaining over an electoral stake and power only, which is what happens in the municipalities. Nobody says my pound of flesh in this conversation, in this coalition conversation, is that energy is important and we need to prioritize these specific solutions to the energy crisis, or there's no deal. That's the kind of negotiation that you need. So in that instance, you're better able to make principled trade-offs than blanket ideological positions where you say, I hate politicians so-and-so, and so I'm not going to enter into a deal with them. Because it's also important that we do not collapse the country with dogma. But the reason ideas and solutions matter is because you can have a sense of priorities, a set of priorities that become your negotiating position in a coalition arrangement. Now, if I were to ask you or anybody who's listening, of the most serious issues that we have in the country, are they really clear what the top three political parties' approaches would be? Honestly. And the answer is no. It's about whether we like so-and-so or not. we can't continue to work like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of somebody like Mampela Rampela, who's had quite a glittering career, right? She was a bit reluctant. She kind of played coy with the DA for a while, and then started her own initiative, and it kind of lost momentum because it was just kind of her own initiative. And then, Musi Maimane, he's had some pretty ambitious goals in terms of his One South Africa movement. He's got a big following on Twitter, for example. But is that necessarily translating into kind of a constituency that's identifiable, that can be mobilized? He's supporting these individual candidates, but it all just seems a bit nebulous. And, the risk there is that all of this energy just kind of gets diffused outwards instead of focused inwards on the core problem, which is unseating the ANC.
Look, I think also South Africa has not been ready for quite a while for change. And unfortunately, I remember publishing an interview with Kgalema Motlanthe when I was Business Day editor. And he said this to the Financial Times too. He said it has to get worse before it gets better. There was a time when if I gave an interview such as this one that I'm giving to you and said the things that I'm saying, a lot of people who now don't like the ANC would have sworn at me. They used to do it. They used to threaten me and say they want to know where I live. They were not ready. Now, the crisis that we have created in various ways has made people ready for change. So the ground is fertile. I think that is the most important thing I can say. And the last, David, that I can say on this question is that political strategy matters, firstly. And the most important aspect of political strategy is to build a broad coalition. And by coalition, I don't mean a party political coalition. You need to build a coalition of forces in society that say, we agree with this idea. That is the idea that we will support, and we will mobilize our own structures and our own constituencies to support that idea. That idea in 2019 was the end of the Zuma era and having a different president. And therefore, there was a coalition, crisis-driven coalition that carried Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC back to power in 2019. The most important task we've got to do is to build that political coalition again. But like I said, again, ideas matter. The grievance alone is not enough. You can't negotiate policy positions and try and come up with them during coalition negotiations in 2024. Can't. It's going to be a disaster again, and we'll collapse this country.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of the holy cows in South Africa. One of those is race-based empowerment policy, which cuts across all levels of the state, increasingly the private sector as well. We now have the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, which is going to empower the Labour Minister to impose race quotas on businesses, a very high degree of ministerial discretion. We've seen preferential procurement policy be abused by nefarious actors. I had Andre de Ruyter on the show talking about these non-value adding intermediaries imposing themselves on Eskom's supply chain. To me, I would say that we need to move entirely away from the highly racialized policy framework that we currently have something more meritocratic, but that also recognizes that many millions of people are marginalized from our economy and need to be uplifted. My view is you uplift them through growth, but also through targeted interventions that focus on disadvantage. Do you think it's time for us to abandon BE as a policy framework in South Africa? So
there's a couple of things that politically are important, David, and anybody who wants to win an election has got to recognize certain things that one has got to say. And that may be different ways of getting to a solution that works. So in 2009, the Congress of the People was doing really well, and then they said they would be opposed to BEE. And a lot of people turned away from the Congress of the People and said, oh, but what are you guys talking about? There's a historical reason for that. The community from which I come had almost all the families being single-parent families because of the migrant labor system. The level of disadvantage a child from there has compared to mine here in Centurion is enormous. And that's a historical issue. It's a racialized issue. I believe the secret to solving the racial anxieties in South Africa is to talk about our history, our racial history, honestly, without making a white person who is living today the sinner from 35 or 40 or 50 years ago. We're simply stating the history for what it is. I worked at Volkswagen, where there is a museum at the factory in Germany that details painfully what was done to Jewish people and people from Russia therein. It doesn't hurt Germans to say so. It is accepted. So the first thing is the acceptance of the kind of history that we have and the social deformities that it has led to. Once you understand that insight, you understand that it is necessary because victims, David, have long memories. And we must be careful not to say things like, we now want to de-recognize your pain because we want to be doing something else. So politically, that's important. So that's the first point that I'm going to make. And therefore, I describe what Black economic empowerment should be in my book. And it is not based on this silly combination of chronism and crude racial goading that the African National Congress is doing, right? But it's important that you recognize the history, otherwise you get nowhere in politics. That's the first one. The second thing I want to say, David, is that we've got to talk about this holistically. If we can't deliver good education outcomes to poor communities, many of whom are Black, you are always going to have this racialized, these race divisions between different sectors of society, which are increasingly about class. And so you need to make sure you've got education outcomes, you've got social infrastructure and so on, so that as a person and a citizen, you begin to produce somebody who's got a better chance of making it in life. Now, that's not an economic theory thing. It's actually just how you construct a society that functions, where people can be productive and so on. Because out of communities which are deformed, historically deformed, you also produce deformed adults who don't contribute to the society as they should. So that's the second point I'm going to make. The third one is we've got to make a difference between chronism and Black economic empowerment. What the ANC has engaged in is chronism. Now, what I propose in my book is that the large deals involving conglomerate companies or JSE-listed companies, if you want to deracialize the ownership structures, leave that to the union and other pension funds. They're sufficiently diverse. They must do that. Don't use government money for that purpose. The government money must be used for the development of private enterprises by individuals or small groups of individuals, because it is by multiplying and growing the number of enterprises in an economy that you are going to get more inclusiveness. Now, part of the racial problems we have is a function of unemployment. Because if people had jobs and were making an income and could look after themselves, they would worry less about whether a white person is doing well or not. So we've got to fix all of these things at the same time, including fixing the government, because part of the reason we are here, where we're having debates about whether you should continue to have BE or not, is because the government is dysfunctional. The state is dysfunctional. I do not know of a single economy that has ever grown when its state is dysfunctional. I want somebody to show it to me, but it doesn't exist. And that means politics, which is why I come back to the same thing, which is you can't avoid involvement in politics, because if the underpinnings are weak, forget it. So, David, I look forward to a future where we do not propose that Patrice Motsepe's child is disadvantaged in comparison to the child of a white or Indian person who lives in a poor area. We can't be that society. That's crude. And therefore, we have to be a society that says we want to uplift the poor, make sure they've got social infrastructure, make sure they've got a chance in life, so that over time, we have a truly inclusive society. That is why I said I believe I have a social democratic outlook. Because it doesn't say race, it says social status, social status and so on. In South Africa, if you were to use that, David, most of those people are Black anyway.
Well,
So you lose
precisely.
nothing.
So
You
that's
lose
why,
nothing.
focusing
Yeah, you
on
lose nothing.
disadvantage and need, I think is really the metric that you're trying to correct,
Yeah,
right?
no.
And so you
You
can
lose
have,
nothing. It's the right measure.
yeah, so you can have bursary programs. I mean, if you think of the NSFAS program, that is administered in a non-racial way. The social grant system in South Africa is also similarly non-racial.
Exactly.
And,
It's
that
the
is fulfilling
politics.
the material needs of those people. All right, well,
It's the politics. It's the politics. It's what works in politics, David. And I think when people shouldn't feel anxious when people talk about Black community and so on, because as a parting shot, one of the things I'll say is, as a Black person who comes from a Black rural community, there are deformities we know that are historical in nature. And when we talk about Black community and Black upliftment, it's not a statement about white people, right? It is a statement about what, if you call the problem by its name, the people who experience it understand it for what it is. We just have political entrepreneurs who traffic in this stuff to further divide society, and that's completely unhelpful.
Right. Well, Songezo, I mean, I think you, in terms of your personal biography, are a fantastic illustration of somebody who has taken opportunities that have been available and, uplifted yourself. I mean, I'm sure you've benefited from the help of others along the way as well. But, I think one of the most important empowering things in your life is to have agency. And to me, the BE framework is basically saying that it's the government that's going to uplift you. You're just a helpless recipient of aid. I think we need to maybe change that mindset in South Africa, that we are the masters of our destiny in the country. If we want to be a competitive country, if we want to see people uplifted, then it's on us. No one's coming to save us. So I wanted to conclude this conversation, Songezo, just with a message to ordinary individuals who might be a bit despondent about the state of affairs. We've endured stage 6 load shedding this week. So I'm sure there are many frowns around South Africa. But what can ordinary individuals in South Africa do to get us towards the much needed change that we need to see in South Africa?
So I'll take your last comment as a question, because there's an important point that needs to be made. So let's talk about my biography. So I got a chance to go to a really good high school in the last 2 years of my life, and it was a private school, built and operated with donor money exclusively. And the people that went to that school are really making a significant contribution. Even Machela Koko went to that school from ESCOM, by the way. And quite a few other people are doing really good work. The chief executive of the Nelson Mandela Children's Hospital went to that school. I can mention a lot of people that you write about that went to that school. So that was private citizens and private enterprise contributing to something good. That's one of the help that I needed. When I went to varsity, I got NSFAS help. Now, government, in that sense, taxes gave me just a leg up to make it. And that's what I mean by catalyzing agent, right? You've got to provide people sufficient assistance to stand on their own 2 feet and compete and make something of their lives, right? So that's what I meant earlier about catalyzing agent, and just leveraging of that biographical history of mine. Now, what can people do? The most important thing that I will ask is to say, please choose a public institution you care about. Just one. Whether that's the Auditor General or the Public Protector's Office or a local institution, and make sure that you focus your activism on that institution. Where it's doing good work, they need to know that you support them, you are here for them. If you think about the staff of the Auditor General, they get intimidated, they get shot and so on. And you know what? Hearing from ordinary citizens saying, we love what you do, we support you, Auditor General, please tell us what you need and we'll support you in different ways. It means so much for people who are trying to make the country work. So if I can leave people with one thing, David, please pick just one institution that you choose to care about and make it the focus of your civic duty. If that's a political party, that's fine. If it's an NGO, that's fine, but please choose one and care about it. And I think this country will go far if we do that.
Songezo Zibi, thank you very much for joining me on Solutions with David Ansara.
Thank you.